By the way, this isn't a backdrop. We really are here in the barrel warehouse. So we do like to point that out to folks. So to be a little bit authentic for you all so that you get somewhat of that experience. But we're gonna chat a lot with you guys and ask you, what are you smelling? What are you tasting throughout this entire tasting? So it's a pretty small, intimate group. So like Casey said, feel free, unmute yourselves, kind of chime in. But if you don't want to speak up on the video, you're more than welcome to drop those tasting notes, those one-word answers into the chat box, and then we'll kind of reiterate that as well. So it just kind of feels like you guys are standing here tasting with us, just like it would be in normal times. And if you guys were out here hanging out doing the tasting with us.
And don't be shy to give tasting notes. There are no right or wrong answers when it comes to how you drink and evaluate your whiskey. And we'll get into that a little bit, but kind of the group power of suggestion is also super, super helpful, because if you're tasting something, chances are someone else is too, and they might need you to say that tasting note, like baking spice or cinnamon, for that like aha to click into. So we like a very we just like to talk a lot. So don't get intimidated about tasting notes. Like, absolutely. Because again, no wrong answers. If that's how you evaluate something, we're not going to argue with that. So definitely speak up and tell us all your tasting notes. We will applaud you and probably agree.
And go ahead, Jeremy.
Oh, I was gonna say that's a great point. Yeah, because I remember back when we used to do tastings at the store a lot. Customers would ask like, "Oh, like what am I tasting on?" This is like, "Well, this is what I taste," but like your palate's different, so it could be something else. And like that's always the fun part too, is like comparing notes with stuff like that. So yeah.
Absolutely. That's the fun interactive part about whiskey, right? It's like a great story and it's meant to be shared, which is what we're going to do today. And just in case, on your little box there are some power of suggestion tasting notes that we as a Laws Village have come up with that we feel like we get off of that. So you can definitely use that if you're struggling to find those adjectives, but we're going to walk you through how to approach a tasting so that it doesn't feel overwhelming. A lot of times with whiskey, it's like you could go to a wine tasting nowadays and nobody feels threatened like they did 10 years ago, right? And so now we're kind of seeing that in the whiskey world where folks are getting a little intimidated by whiskey tastings, but they're totally fine at a wine tasting. And there is a lot of overlap there. So we'll chat quite a bit about that today. But yeah, should we give them a few more minutes or should we go ahead and get some whiskey in the glasses?
Oh yeah, no, let's start. Yeah, if they join, that's fine. And this is also being recorded so they get a chance to watch it later, if need be. So yeah, so we'll get started then. So yeah, again, everybody, thanks for coming out on a Thursday for this, or coming in for a Thursday for this. But yeah, so we're gonna be talking about Laws whiskey tonight. I was introduced to Laws last year when I was actually working for a wine warehouse. Where it was brought into the company closer to the end of me leaving. And I just thought they were really interesting back then because, there was these styles of like rye. I don't remember what the name of the rye used to be called before it was the St. Louis rye. But that one was just really interesting to me. It was like very intriguing flavors. And then I remember trying it was the wheat, and was really big fan of that one too. And I just thought they were really cool, interesting whiskeys. And I tried to bring them into the wine country before I worked there. Didn't work as well, but that's the advantage of being the buyers. You get to bring in what you like. So brought these in, and then when I found out that they had these little quad sets, I'd already started doing these events with y'all, and I was like, oh, this is a perfect setup for this. This is the perfect way to show Laws to everybody and give a nice introduction to the brand, to our customers. So yeah, I was able to reach out to the folks at Laws, and then Crystal was available for this, and then she was letting me know that Casey was going to join us for it as well. So I was really excited about that, and excited that you guys are here to try it with us. And you guys have already been introduced, but yeah, let me reintroduce you again to Crystal and Casey.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, Jeremy, and we're super happy to be here with you all. I am the tasting room manager here at Laws Whiskey House, and Casey works with me in the tasting room as one of our brand ambassadors. So we are both very, very knowledgeable about the product line, about doing tastings with folks, about making people feel comfortable on tastings, because we do this on every single tour. And that is an open invitation to any of you all. Should you find yourselves in Denver, Colorado, please do come say hi to us in the tasting room. We would love to give you a tour. We'd love to say hi. We'd love to toast a dram of whiskey with you all anytime you may find yourselves out here. But without further ado, let's do what we're all here to do, and let's get some whiskey in our glasses and let's start talking about it. So we are going to start with the barley whiskey, which is our malt whiskey. This is the blue bottle. We have made it color coded, so it's nice and easy for you all. So later on, when we had 4 glasses of these, you can be like, I don't know, I like the red one. But that way you can look back and figure out which one you guys enjoy. So yeah, let's go ahead. Let's pour some of that malt in your glass. And like we said, this may or may not be your Friday, so pour accordingly. And then we're going to go through a guided whiskey tasting. And we're going to do this 3-step process with all 4 of these whiskeys. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So the first step in any guided whiskey tasting is we're actually going to nose this whiskey, right? But this comes with a bit of a cautionary tale, right? I did mention there's a lot of overlap between wine and whiskey. However, with whiskey, we don't want to dig our nose deep into this glass. You will singe your olfactories, kind of like burning your tongue on a hot piece of pizza, right? It's not going to stop us from eating the pizza, but we're not going to get as much flavor off of that pizza as we normally would. So I like to refer to what we call the nose zone. So I think the bottom of your chin to the top of your chest is a really great nose zone to rock that glass back and forth. And here's the kicker. Anytime you're trying a high proof spirit, part your lips when you're nosing it, right? Breathe in through your mouth as well as your nose. You're gonna get a whole lot more than you would if your mouth was just closed. And if you don't believe me, you can try it both ways. But just parting your lips ever so slightly, breathing in through your mouth as well as your nose. Other than alcohol, college, and regrets, what do you all smell on this glass? And by the way, we're isolating one singular grain right now. So we are just exploring the barley grain. So this will be a little bit one-dimensional, but we should get some interesting tasting notes. And does anybody want to unmute themselves and share? Or does anybody want to drop a tasting note in the chat? Anything that's kind of jumping out at you? By the way, with this barley, this is the closest thing to Scotch that we can make here in America. This would kind of be our version of like sparkling wine, just like we could do everything that champagne is doing in California, right? But we have to call it sparkling wine. So this would kind of be our version of American single malt if we were able to make Scotch in America, right?
And remember, this is just our acclimation. We're just prepping our palate to really get ready to appreciate the whiskey. Mm-hmm. So if what you smell right now is whiskey, that's what it smells like. That is a right answer. There are no wrong answers in whiskey. But nosing your whiskey is a huge, important part. I think we all kind of know this, but I don't think everyone understands how important nosing is. We always start off with nosing, with acclimating our palate, because all whiskey basically tastes the same. Blasphemy to say, I know, but when I say taste the same, I mean our taste buds are only giving us those 5 things, right? Like sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and then the umami, like savory, meaty taste. But we now know, scientists know, that humans can detect up to 1 trillion different smells. So a lot of how you evaluate your whiskey is actually through your nose. You are going to smell it first before it comes through in your taste buds. So that's why we don't want to singe our olfactory nerves, because that's how we smell. And if you singe your olfactory nerves, if you dig your nose too far into a glass of whiskey, it actually takes 30 to 40 minutes for your body to regenerate those nerves. So if you dig your nose into a glass of whiskey like it's a fine wine, you may actually ruin your whole evaluating experience kind of before you even get started.
Ooh, shortbread cookie. Yes.
Oh, yes.
Like a Girl Scout. Yes. And cocoa. Mm-hmm. And then we always kind of get, we kind of get like that hay, that grassy note. But for me, for sure, the barley, I mean, it tastes like the earth that the grain is grown in. It really does have that like earthy note to it. And then definitely a bit of a sweet note as well that's still kind of present right there. Awesome. Okay, so next step is we are going to acclimate our palates. So we are going to take this first tiny sip together. Ooh, a sweet and sour, like a green apple. Nice, absolutely. That is a solid tasting note on this malt. So yeah, we're gonna take a tiny sip of this. And you may have heard the term like chew on the whiskey down in Kentucky, right? Well, I like to describe it a little bit differently. Here in Colorado, I like to think that we all have very good dental health and we all know how to mouthwash the whiskey, right? But again, it's just reminding you to take that sip of whiskey and really coat your entire palate. Like think about those 5 tasting zones on your tongue and make sure the whiskey hits all of those points on your palate, right? If you take a tiny little sip and you just hit the front of your tongue, you're only activating that front part of your palate, right? So let's take this tiny sip together, swish it around like mouthwash, chew on it like they do down in Kentucky, right? But we are going to do a couple more things with this, but this is our first acclimation sip. We're basically waking up our taste buds. So we'll do that together. Cheers, y'all. Okay, so a couple natural reactions may be happening to you, right? Your tongue may be salivating, your gums might be tingly, you might let out a cough, and your eyes might start to water. These are natural physiological reactions to poison, which is what we just gave your body, right? But at this moment, your brain is confirming with your palate, and it's saying, no, no, this isn't poison. This is actually really good whiskey, but the solution to dilution is pollution. So that's why your body is naturally having that reaction there. So while that reaction may be happening on your palate, let's go back, part our lips, give it a nose. Tell me, did that smell change for you at all, just from before to now? Or are we still getting those sweet notes of cocoa, shortbread cookie, maybe green apple, right? Did anything change or are we tasting the same?
It definitely got
Might be
earthier for me. Like more of those grassy kind of earthier notes definitely pop out more now on the nose than yeah before. It still has some of that sweetness, but yeah, definitely more of that earthiness that you were mentioning earlier.
More cocoa,
Yes.
absolutely. Like shaved chocolate shavings, right? Like almost, yeah, absolutely.
So you may be able to pick out something much more distinct where that first smell might have been whiskey, but now this second smell you are like, oh, I do smell that cocoa. Or it may just smell more inviting, a little more sweeter.
Yeah. Cool. So everyone is different. When you are ready, when your tongue stops salivating, when your gums stop tingly, when you stop coughing, all of the above, right? You're ready to go in for your second sip of whiskey. So remember that first sip was simply acclimation. We can never judge a whiskey on that first sip. We lose 90% of people in the whiskey world that set that glass down and go, woo, thank you, no thank you. I don't like drinking jet fuel, right? So you always have to acclimate your palate before you can start to appreciate that whiskey. So second sip, once again, not a bad idea to treat it like mouthwash, really coat your palate, give it that second sip, and then please share with us. Does it taste different or does it taste the same as it did on that first sip?
Oh yes, much smoother for me after that acclimation.
And I'm gonna play off that shortbread cookie one. This is kind of where I get like that snickerdoodle cookie, right? Like it definitely like a little bit of that sugar and spice to it. But yeah, I definitely get that nice sugar cookie taste.
And a great indicator for me for malt in general, like if I'm doing a blind tasting, I know when I'm tasting a malt because malt is very earthy for me, but also just kind of like this fresh wood and sawdust. That's what always comes to my mind, which comes from my own memories. And then also kind of like that almond, like toasted almond and hazelnut on the back.
I do get that nutty note.
That nutty sweetness that I get.
Absolutely. I don't know if anyone here ever drinks Madeira, but kind of like that nutty quality of a Madeira, I definitely pick up on that on the barley for sure.
Definitely, yeah.
Dark chocolate, toasted nuttiness, absolutely. Absolutely like a toasted nut for sure.
And just like Crystal said, we lose a lot of potential whiskey drinkers on that first sip, right? Very, very sad. So now you know with kind of these first 2 steps of this process, this acclimation smell sip, and then this evaluation smell sip, if you have any non-whiskey drinkers in your life, very, very sad, I know, but you can possibly turn them over to the dark side or the light side, whatever way you'd like to look at it, with introducing them to this kind of acclimation and prepping their palate before they actually evaluate and appreciate the whiskey.
Absolutely. So that was your judgment sip. So feel free, chime in, drop it in the chat. What do y'all think of that barley?
It's really good. I like it. But I was wondering, the acclimation sip, do you always use a malt whiskey, or what would you recommend if we were to introduce somebody?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as the lineup goes that's in your little quad packs, we kind of have started with the lighter, what we consider lighter, right? Again, we're high proof spirit, but what we think are the lighter single grains, because we're starting with that barley, and then the next one we're going to move into is the 100% wheat whiskey. Then our third taste is going to be our 4-grain straight bourbon. So that's going to be the most in-depth whiskey that we're going to try today, because that does have all 4 grains in it. So when we are truly exploring those single grains, they're going to be a little bit, like I said, more one-dimensional. And then, of course, the last one that we're going to move to is the rye whiskey, which typically ryes are a bit on the spicier, I say full-bodied, right? Kind of similarly to wine. So definitely whenever you're lining up a tasting at home, you can also do it by proof points, right? So like if you have something that's at 80 proof, something that's at 90 proof, something that's at 100 proof, I would always start with your lower proof point and work your way up. If, for example, everything you're trying is bonded and it's all at 100 proof, but then you have some single grains and some that are actually a bourbon, which will be multiple grains together, I would try those single grains first, like we're doing, before we move into that bourbon. But yeah, it just kind of depends. It's just like with wine where you want to do like lightest bodied to fullest bodied. But sometimes when it's whiskey, well, they're all full bodied, right? Because they're all going to be that high proof spirit. But yeah, just kind of starting with anything that's on the lighter side, going into something that's heavier is the best way to do it. And then also there's no right or wrong way. So once again, after today, if you guys have a little bit left in your little bottles, like wait a day or so, maybe this weekend, right? Take the 4 bottles back out, rearrange the order that you try them in, right? And like, don't do them in the same order that we did today. You may find that you get entirely different tasting notes on any one of these whiskeys because you're revisiting it on a different day with a different palate, with a different mindset going into it, right? So a lot of times at these whiskey competitions, like they'll be tasting upwards of 20 different samples. And a lot of times they revisit those samples throughout the course of a week before they actually reach their final judgment, because the order in which you taste things, the further we get acclimated, like by the time we get to this bourbon, you guys may or may not pick out far more sweet notes than you did on the first couple, because once again, your palate is getting acclimated to that point, right? So yeah, there is no right or wrong way to do it, but there is fun ways to approach it and try them in different ways. Yeah.
So, Crystal, I actually have a question. So, I know we do this with wine where there's like we have the biodynamic calendar that like tells you know it's going to be like a fruit day or a root day for that. Like I've also kind of noticed that in spirits too, but like do they have that kind of like calendar, or like I know there's the app, like what day is it for like wine? Like has anybody tried to do that with spirits yet?
Man, I don't, not to my knowledge, but that's $1 million app idea right there. Somebody write that down. But yeah, absolutely. Like, and there is a lot of crossover between the two. But to my knowledge, there doesn't exist something that's like that currently. But I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that there's no wrong day to drink a whiskey. As long as you're drinking whiskey, you're doing it right. So any day that ends in a Y is a good day to drink some whiskey. So
I like that theory too.
Acclimation process, it's a good way to introduce new people to drinking whiskey, but it's a great way for you to try any whiskey, especially when you just bought a whiskey that you're trying for the first time. Again, no right or wrong way to drink. If you're drinking whiskey, you're drinking it right. We applaud you. Drink it neat, drink it with water, drink it with Coke. If you're drinking whiskey, good for you.
Yeah.
But this acclimation and then that neat sip is a great way to try any new whiskey, because you do have to think kind of this neat sip after you've acclimated your palate. That's how the distillers, the barrel managers, kind of everything behind the distillery, they're envisioning you trying and appreciating that whiskey.
Okay, so third step in our tasting process. I did ask you guys to grab a water bottle, some kind of distilled water, spring water, from your Brita, just not straight out of the tap, right? So we are going to introduce a tiny little drop of water. So feel free, if you have like your cap, right? I would just pour a tiny little bit in your cap and then just introduce that to your water. If you have a straw handy, go ahead and just kind of do a little droplet that way. You guys may or may not be fancy enough to have those little like droplets, droppers for the water. But yeah, by introducing that one little tiny drop of water, I want you to check out your glass when you do that, right? It'll be easier for you guys to see it in your own glass. But as you introduce that water, check out your glass. We're creating an exothermic heat reaction. So we're actually heating this whiskey up. And in essence, just like in wine, right? We introduced water. This has natural fusel oils in it. So water and oil tend to separate, aerating itself, oxidating itself, right? That's a naughty word in the wine world, but in the whiskey world, we absolutely want our whiskey to have a slight oxidation to it, right? Anytime you take one of these big bottles home, pop that top off. Let it sit for like 15 minutes before you go ahead and pour it in your glass, or pour it in your glass and let it sit in your glass for 15 minutes, right? You really want a little bit of oxygen to open up that whiskey, just like if it was like a 20-year-old Barolo from Italy, right? It needs a moment to interact with that oxygen to really open itself up. So by introducing that little bit of water, we are in essence decanting our whiskey, right? It just happens in about 30 to 45 seconds versus a few minutes when you're doing that with a bottle of wine. So once you've introduced that droplet, if you saw your little reaction happen, if you missed it, don't worry, we're gonna do this 3 more times. But it is pretty cool, right? When you introduce that water, you really do see that separation happen in your glass. So go ahead, part your lips, give it a nose. Tell us what you guys smell on this smell versus the other two. It always gets a bit sweeter for me when we introduce the water.
Yeah, the same smells, but it smells softer.
Yeah, right? Definitely softer, sweeter. And
Yeah,
definitely
more of that shortbread cookie again.
yeah.
But then there's also a little bit of that, again, more of that kind of earthy hay, like more of that kind of floral hay aspect to it.
Absolutely. Kind of like a hayride in October, right? When you're sitting on those barrels of hay and you just can't help but smell it, right? And then of course I get the hives because I'm allergic to it, but you know.
Just thinking about it. And I mean, for me, a lot of that sweetness really comes out with a little bit of water, and a lot of that earthiness kind of dials back for me. So again, there's no right or wrong way to drink whiskey. You're drinking it right. Some people can be snobby about adding water to their whiskey, but water does not make it any better or worse, right? You're truly just changing the characteristics of your whiskey. When you add even just a little bit of water, you're changing what characteristics stay silent and what characteristics pop. So you're just really just changing your whole drinking experience with adding just a little tiny bit of water. And you can do it drop by drop too, and taste it after each drop and find exactly where you like that amount of water. I always like to say, just watch out, start slowly. It's like a haircut. So if you go too far, you can't go back. I made that mistake during COVID. I'm still trying to grow it out again. So always start slowly with your water and your haircut choices, is all I'm saying.
That's just valuable life advice. You're welcome. You're welcome. We're here to teach you how to taste whiskey and give you little nuggets of life advice.
That's what happens with great whiskey comes great knowledge and power. So there's one of my little knowledgeable pieces for you.
All righty, give this a taste with that water added to it and tell us what y'all taste on this one. It doesn't finish quite as sweet for me as I kind of was thinking. This is where I'm getting a little bit more of that tobacco note. It still isn't quite like a super full-bodied like cigar. It's definitely more like a sweet tobacco, like a pipe tobacco for me, but definitely getting some still sweet notes that are hanging out there.
Yeah, definitely that like tobacco tea leaf though, or the tea leaf and tobacco, like those more floral kind of notes to it for sure.
Yeah, piece of paper or something? Yeah, I was just trying to write a couple notes, but I mean, I can use my hand.
Also, don't make haircut choices after drinking whiskey. So don't try to trim your own hair after drinking whiskey. Another life lesson from me. I'm telling you from a personal experience.
Ed's like, oh, haircuts. Awesome. So guys, that is a 3-step whiskey evaluation process, right? So just to recap, we poured whiskey in our glass. We first acclimated our olfactories, right? We gave it a couple good smells. A lot of times, if you do that a couple good times, take some good inhales, you'll actually start to activate parts of the palate without even having taken a sip of it, right? So sometimes that can happen for you. Then we went ahead and did our acclimation sip, where we kind of coated our palate with it. Let that kind of reaction happen to us. Went back in, we nosed that whiskey one more time. We tasted it one more time. That's our judgment sip. And then third step was when we introduced a little bit of that water. This is what we call flowering the whiskey, opening it up, right? And that's when we nosed it one more time and tasted it one more time. So we are completely done with that barley whiskey. If you guys want to continue to enjoy that, the next one we're going to move on to is going to be the 100% wheat whiskey. And that's in the red bottle. So if you want to go ahead and prep your glasses with that. And I'm going to hand it back to Casey in the studio. She's going to take over for the wheat whiskey tasting.
I am, because I do love this expression, which is 100% wheat. So it is 50% raw wheat, 50% malted wheat. So just remember, we get to try these 100% expressions. So we went from this barley grain, 100% barley, to now a completely different grain, 100% wheat. And then we'll move on to our bourbon next, where you kind of get to see these two grains play off of each other with a couple other grains in there as well. So as we're pouring, let's talk about some tasty notes a little bit again, because everybody, again, we say don't get intimidated. There are no right or wrong answers. And if you're having trouble pulling tasty notes, think back, dial it back to super, super simple. Dial it back to your memories. We're again here to tell you that there is no wrong answer when you're shouting out tasty notes and evaluating a whiskey. We talked about your olfactory nerves, the nerves that help you smell, where we think those are so important. We don't want to burn those nerves because that's such a big part of evaluating. Your olfactory nerves are actually linked directly to the limbic system in your brain, which is the part of your brain that stores memories. So a lot of how you evaluate whiskey actually comes from your memories. And guess what? They're your memories, so we can't argue with those memories. So it's completely okay if you get something like Christmas before you can dial it back and bring it back to like cloves or baking spices. So if you get Christmas, if you get, I don't know what this is, but it tastes like that one time I went camping the second weekend in June and was sitting around a campfire at 2 a.m. That's exactly what this whiskey tastes like. Like, just go with that. But let's go ahead and give it a nose. We kind of are acclimating our palate as we go. So we don't really need to do that acclimation sip smell on the second one. Our palate's already kind of primed and ready, right? So this first nose, and then we'll take this first sip, is our evaluation sip. Toasted vanilla, that's a good one. Anybody else want to throw out anything? I get a little more spice on that nose.
Yeah. I always get the orange, the citrus that speaks to me with the wheat. It always jumps out. It's like we just twisted an orange over the glass and I'm getting those essential oils.
Oh, cinnamon apricot. That's actually a great one. I'm going to use that together. Oh.
And cinnamon, so just to piggyback off of what Casey's saying, we are so in tune with this because we drink a lot for you all, but we can actually dial it in because we make a straight product here at Law's Whiskey House, which is an honest product, 5 ingredients: water, grain, yeast, time in the barrel. That's it, right? So when you guys share these tasting notes, we're pretty dialed into the fact of whether or not you're tasting a grain note or whether or not you're tasting a barrel note. And 100% that cinnamon note that you're getting on this wheat is coming from the grain itself. So that is a grain tasting note that you guys are getting. There's a lot of molecular compounds that are found within the grains and found within the wood that we age the whiskey in these barrels. So definitely sharing these notes with us, we can dial that in. That toasted vanilla that someone else mentioned, that's a barrel note. So if you're ever at a pretentious whiskey tasting and they're like, oh my God, this has such deep barrel notes, all they're really saying is they're getting a lot of vanilla and a lot of caramel, because those are indicative of molecular compounds found in that barrel, in the wood, right? So just so you guys know, you can throw it out there too and be like, oh my God, these barrel notes are so rich. And then you know what you're talking about as far as that. Yeah.
So give this wheat a taste if you haven't already. Cheers. Ooh, and we get that cinnamon. We get this, I get kind of a heat, a spice off of the wheat that tends to surprise people, right? Because you think like wheat bread, you think this like soft, nice wheat, but wheat does have kind of a kick to it. And remember, this is 100% wheat. So it might be a little bit in your face. Because I get a lot of that cinnamon.
There's a bit of that whiskey burn, right? That we kind of get, that folks talk about, or you may have heard the whiskey hug, right? It feels like it's warming you from the insides. And like Casey said, a lot of times folks are surprised that the wheat whiskey kind of brings that little bit of that whiskey hug, right?
That's why we love, the reason that we can detect all of these notes but still make a straight product, right? I get people honestly all the time. We make a straight product. We don't add any flavor to our whiskey. We don't make flavored whiskeys. So sometimes people are so surprised to be able to distinctly pick out some of those flavors. Like, oh, I get cinnamon. Oh, I get apple. Oh, I get banana. How am I getting these distinct flavors if they're not added in there? And it is science, organic chemistry. I always say that organic chemistry would have been way more interesting in high school and college if they added a whiskey component to it.
Totally.
I probably would have passed. Let's just be honest.
I've talked to some teacher friends. They're not on board with me, but I still think this is important. But just like people said, we can pinpoint almost every flavor to either the grain or the part of the distillation process. Because every part of this process, there are these molecules just bouncing around and then forming together to create these molecular flavor compounds. So same molecular flavor compound found in cinnamon is found in the wheat grain. The same molecular flavor compound found in hazelnuts and almonds are found in barley. So when you taste that almond, that hazelnut, you're truly tasting that barley grain. Vanilla, maple syrup, caramel, those are barrel notes because of those molecular flavor compounds found there. So super interesting way to kind of break down all of those flavors.
Disclaimer, if you are drinking Fireball, they added the cinnamon and that's not a barrel or a grain note. So disclaimer there. There's
Also,
Fireball though, there is.
Fireball has a spot, but also if you're drinking Fireball, you're usually not at the wine country. And again, we appreciate people who drink Fireball. Everybody has their levels, but yeah, it's not.
That's fair. That's fair. We don't like to drop names too often, but that's one we'll drop. But yeah.
Yeah, that's fair.
And then for the last part, this is my favorite for the wheat, is to introduce that little bit of water. The wheat, I think, changes and opens up the most dramatically out of any of our expressions of whiskey.
And don't forget to hold your glass up and check it out when you're doing it. You're going to see that reaction happening where you're going to see that whiskey separating. It does happen pretty quickly within 30 seconds. So I always suggest you hold your glass up at eye level when you're introducing that water.
And again, this one's just the most dramatic. For me personally, introduce a little bit of water to that wheat. A lot of that heat, a lot of that spice dissipates, and I get so much more of that orange and chocolate. It's just so much sweeter, dramatically different with just a little bit of that water. And then, oh, sorry, go on.
No worries. I was just going to say, if we were to add a fourth step to this guided whiskey tasting, that would be introducing an ice cube, right? But you can't do it in the same glass that you've introduced your water, because you really need to understand what is happening when you introduce that ice cube. So essentially, if you finish this off, poured yourself a little bit more wheat, dropped an ice cube in there, you would see a completely different amplifying of flavor notes and muting of flavor notes for sure. And I will tell you guys, this is one of my favorite expressions to enjoy over an ice cube, because like I mentioned, I get a lot of those orange citrusy notes. So when I drop an ice cube in here, I'm a little bit lazy. I bartended for 10 years. So when I drop an ice cube in here, it's almost like I'm drinking an old fashioned without having anything or anything, because it brings out those bright citrus notes. And this is absolutely one of my favorites to like sit on the front porch, hang out, sip on this, and really truly enjoy it over an ice cube. So that would be like a fourth step to this tasting. Depending upon what nerd level you guys are willing to get to, that would be another way to try a whiskey, is to see what it tastes like with that water added to it, and then try it again with an ice cube added to it. You are doing two different things when you're introducing room temperature water versus an ice cube.
And then great question about our wheat and why we chose our wheat and the Centennial Wheat, which is a great segue to kind of just talk about all of our grains that are all these Colorado kind of terroir driven grains, which we put a lot of care and effort into. All our grains are Colorado grown. We go down to the San Luis Valley, Alamosa, Colorado, to the Cody family, which is this 5th generational farming family, to get our wheat, rye, and barley. They grow our wheat, rye, and barley, and they also malt all our grains for us. They were the first farm to ever provide barley to Coors back in the day, so they've been around a long, long time. And they grow these really unique heirloom grains for us that we find have all this really cool flavor that you really don't get from these like high yield commodity grains, right? They actually found the wheat and the rye and essentially bred them out of almost extinction. The San Luis Valley has a very unique terroir down there, which you hear in the wine world a lot, that term terroir, which is basically, you know, French for of the earth. It's basically how the soil or the earth affects the flavor of the grape or grain, right? And the wine world has known the secrets of terroir for a long time. They know you can take that same exact varietal of Pinot Noir grape, plant it on 4 different vineyards, do the exact same process, winemaking process, and get 4 very distinct Pinot Noir wines from just where it's grown. The whiskey world has never really cared about that in the past. I think in the last 5 years, a lot of craft distilleries, not just us, but a lot of those smaller craft distilleries are really able to step back and focus on their regional heirloom terroir driven grains, which is super, super cool. If you think about all of the distilleries in the country, about 85% of whiskey distilleries in the country get their grains from just 5 farms in the entire country. And they're getting these high yield commodity grains. So in these next 10, really 20 years, I think you're going to watch the American whiskey region change, because there's a lot of states, a lot of small craft distilleries in these states stepping back. And so New York is doing really cool things with regional grains. Pennsylvania, Texas, Colorado, California. So in these 10 to 20 years, you'll much more see like New York whiskeys, Colorado whiskeys, and they'll be known for those unique heirloom grains that grow around them. So we try to do honor to our state, our region, and all of those grains. So we pick these farmers that we love and trust that have these unique heirloom flavored grains. We try to do honor to that, to all of the places our grains are grown, by naming those whiskeys kind of after those. So, I mean, we are the Centennial State, so we make this Centennial Wheat. The San Luis Valley rye, they've done genetic testing on that rye and found that it only grows in the San Luis Valley of Colorado. It does not grow anywhere else in the world. They're looking on trademarking that rye right now as the San Luis Valley rye. Our Henry Road malt. Henry Road is literally the road that runs along that barley field on the Cody family farm. So we are very, very in tune and care very much about kind of these terroir driven grains that are very, very important to us.
And that Centennial soft white wheat is going to give you a different flavor profile than, say, like red wheat, which is very, very well known and usually used in your wheated bourbons. And there's not even a whole lot of 100% wheat whiskeys out there. I don't know exactly how many there are, but I mean, I would venture to guess it's less than a dozen or so out there in the world. Like, there's not a whole bunch of those that's 100% that. However, we do have quite a few wheated bourbons out on the market, right? And typically a lot of those do use that red wheat grain, which is going to give you an entirely different flavor profile than this soft white Centennial wheat grain that we're using for sure. So even with our rye, even with our wheat, if people are like, oh, I don't really like that. I know I've tried that. I've tried brand A, I've tried brand B, I've tried brand C, like, oh, that's not really my jam. We always encourage them with a complimentary little nip. And it's like, just give this one a try, right? Because this is going to taste different than brand A, brand B, or brand C. And sometimes you might surprise yourself that you actually like the taste of that versus how Casey was talking about these high yield grains that are readily available, a commodity grain for sure. So finish out your wheat whiskey. Give us some tasting notes. Oh yeah, Jeremy.
Just a quick note to go back to what Casey was talking about the terroir aspect of it. The other cool thing another one of the cool things I think Laws does, if y'all look at the quad set box, is on the, well, I can't see it because I have the green screen behind me, but they show you on the map of where in Colorado this stuff comes from. So it lets you know exactly where exactly where the stuff is, in accordance to where they are in Denver. So yeah, it just again points to that they care about what they're doing and they show you what they're doing and they're very honest about it, which I'm a huge fan.
Even color coded, right? Those
It
little
is
bars. So
indeed.
like the little blue diamond, red diamond, yellow diamond, that's where we grow all our wheat, rye, and barley, right? Oh, blue, orange, and green. And then you can see that yellow diamond way out in the corner of the state in Burlington, Colorado. That is where our corn is grown. That's grown by the Whiskey sisters. They are as cool as they sound. I cannot stress that enough. The Whiskey sisters are the best. But not only do they grow our corn, but they recognize the importance of terroir and these kind of regional grains. And they've set up this really awesome brokerage where they're connecting these craft distilleries in and around Colorado to these unique heirloom farmers. So not only are they pushing their own farm and their own grains, but they've set up this really awesome network in Colorado and kind of surrounding states of just craft distilleries and farmers just like really supporting each other's art and craft, which is super cool.
All right.
That's
so what
really cool.
Whiskey.
Do we have a favorite? We've tried two now. Do we have any malt people or any wheat people?
Wheat people.
Wheat.
There we
wheat,
go. All right.
okay.
Nice. Okay, cool. So the next one that we are going to try is going to be the 4-grain straight bourbon. So this one has the gold label. So now we are going to explore a bourbon. Previously, we've been exploring whiskeys, right? So I know that chatting with Jeremy, you guys are all super aficionados, but I do just like even the aficionados, like what these words mean on this label, right? Because that's what really equates to the price point that you all are paying when you go into these liquor stores, right? So on our label here, it says 4-grain straight bourbon whiskey, right? So I don't know if we all know, but I'll just go ahead and say it. Whiskey, as defined by our federal government, is a distilled spirit derived from grain with whiskey-like characteristics. That is it, period. That's the definition, right? So we don't get a whole lot off of the whiskey definition, right? But now we are drinking a bourbon whiskey. So all bourbon is whiskey, not all whiskey is bourbon, right? So with bourbon, we like to describe this like the ABCs. So bourbon is the American spirit. That was as of 1964, that barrier for bourbon became America. If you want to argue with me on that, guess what? Kentucky's part of America, so we're A-okay there. So that barrier for bourbon is America, right? Previous to 1964, yes, you can find Mexican bourbon out there. I do not suggest you spend your money on it. Let's leave the tequila to them. But that barrier for bourbon for America was as of 1964, right? Also, bourbon legally has to be 51% corn. So as of this point, we have not let you guys know what our mash bill is on our 4-grain straight bourbon. So it is 60% corn, 20% wheat, 10% rye, and 10% malted barley. So because we have fully explored that barley and we have fully explored that wheat, just remember that's going down to 20% in this mash bill and 10% of that malt in this mash bill, right? Also with bourbon, has to be aged in a brand new charred oak barrel, right? So here in Colorado, we have quite a few brewery friends of ours that are just chomping at the bits to get our used barrels because there's about 25 pounds of spirit that's actually trapped in that barrel that we cannot harvest. So we do sell those barrels to our brewery friends. They'll stick their barrel-aged beers in it. They'll age those barrel-aged beers, and then they'll sell those beers to you all at probably a higher proof point. Sitting at like 12%, 13% for a beer, which is pretty high, right? And that's because we're starting out at 95 proof, 50% ABV on our whiskeys, right? So yeah, it has to be made in America, has to go into that brand new charred oak barrel, has to be at least 51% corn. Just in case we have any super nerds out there, it cannot come off the still hotter than 160 proof, and it can't go into this barrel hotter than 125 proof, right? So those are requirements for bourbon. So just keep in mind, like the more regulations that we as distillers have to follow, then that kind of equates to those price points that you all are seeing, but you just know that there's that quality assurance that goes into that bottle. There is a consumer keyword I want you guys to pay attention to on your little bottles, and that is that word straight. Okay, whenever you see that word straight on a bottle, whether it's from Laws or anywhere else, that's telling you as the consumer that that spirit spent a minimum of 2 years aging in that barrel, right? Our minimum age statement here at Laws Whiskey House is 3 years. That's where we feel like our minimum age statement is, but legally to put straight on that bottle, 2 years in that barrel. That's important. The flip side of that definition is no flavoring and no coloring can be added to that product. So 100% of this beautiful color that we see in these bottles is coming from the time that spirit spent aging in that barrel. Roughly 60–70% of what we're going to taste when we're trying these whiskeys and this bourbon is coming from the time that spirit spent aging in that barrel. Time is a very critical ingredient, and one of our mantras here at Laws Whiskey House is there are no shortcuts. So no, we have never aged our spirit in a small barrel. Everything we have ever aged has been in a full-size 53-gallon barrel, minimum 3 years in that barrel. And hey, we just celebrated our 10th distilling anniversary. So absolutely, when we're creating these batches for these bottles for our bourbon, there's definitely going to be a 3-year-old barrel in there, but hey, there may be a 6-year-old barrel, a 7-year-old barrel, a 9-year-old barrel, right? And that's what we gather to create our batches so that you all get that nice, well-rounded, full-bodied, 4-grain straight bourbon, and you can actually we explore this. So without further ado, get some bourbon in your glass and pour that for you. Once again, we are already acclimated, so part your lips, give it a nose. And we're gonna hang out here with this bourbon for just a moment because there's gonna be a lot more going on than we've had in the previous two, right? So going off of your tasting notes, right? Does anybody get that vanilla? Does anybody get that chocolate? Does anybody get that, I guess that cocoa or that butterscotch, right? The nuttiness. Think about everything that we've kind of chatted about and see if you can pull that out in this 4-grain straight bourbon.
And while you guys are pulling out your tasting notes, I'll come and show you kind of one of the inside of our barrels so you can see what that looks like. We do use a char number 3, which is pretty industry standard, but there's a lot of natural vanillin, a lot of natural wood sugars in this oak wood, right? So when you char that, you are essentially caramelizing, right? Like a creme brulee. So as that barrel ages, that barrel truly breathes the whiskey in and out. It's pulling that whiskey in and then pushing it back out. So that's where we get all that nice color, all of that, a lot of that flavor, right? Through that char, like a Brita filter. And then this red line right here that you guys can see, that is as far as that whiskey has penetrated the barrel. So that is that whiskey that's trapped in the barrel that we can't access, that devil's cut, right? I don't know if you've ever seen that Jim Beam commercial with Mila Kunis, but she can just squeeze the devil's cut out of those staves. We unfortunately do not have a Mila Kunis here at Laws to access that devil's cut for us. Crystal tried, but we do not have Mila Kunis's skills, unfortunately. But that's why we can sell those back to the breweries, right? That's why they love it so much to make those awesome barrel-aged beers.
And we are being cheeky. We love Mila. She's amazing.
We do love Mila.
Hey, Bad Moms is a great series.
There you go.
Those movies are hilarious.
Alrighty, so giving this a nose. What do you guys pick up? What are you smelling? Remember to always part your lips. Always, always, always breathe in through your mouth and your nose.
I definitely get the like the toasted vanilla. There's a little bit of that like orange citrusy note too.
Yeah,
And there's a little bit more like a maple syrup, like it kind of gets a little richer, like a little bit more of that maple syrupy kind of
absolutely.
nose to me.
I get a lot of that kind of black tea in here, those tea leaves in here.
Yep.
Mm.
Dark cherries, like the good, like the maraschino cherries. I always get that tasting note for sure. Nutty and almond,
Nutty
absolutely.
almond for sure.
Almost like a peanut brittle, right?
Mm.
Absolutely. Or an almond brittle. They make those too.
And again, when you're doing your tasting notes, go from your memories. Crystal knows it's kind of an inside joke. I have some pet peeves over some tasting notes, such as marzipan. Marzipan is one you see everywhere. You see it in those snobby whiskey write-ups. You see it in the liquor stores where they do like the little tasting note things. It's like everything tastes like marzipan, 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 marzipan. So I always thought marzipan was kind of this like heavily like almost snooty, highbrow tasting note. And I was like, I don't get marzipan. Well, guess what? I actually don't know about you, but I can't remember if I have actually ever tried marzipan in my entire life. So I do not have that memory. So even though you see marzipan everywhere as the snobby tasting note, it will never be a tasting note for me because I don't have that connection, that memory to unlock that. And that's absolutely okay. So don't get hung up on really detailed tasting notes. Don't get hung up on marzipan. Just truly go with what you know.
And your olfactories, your palate, right? They are highly trainable. They are like any other muscle in your body. So you do not skip leg day at the gym. You don't skip olfactory training day either. And what that looks like is the next time you're cooking, the next time you're baking, and you're pulling spices out of your cabinet, take a moment, close your eyes, revisit what cinnamon smells like, revisit what nutmeg smells like, what clove, anise, right? Any of those tasting notes. When you're cutting up your fresh fruit for your fruit salad, take a moment, really evaluate what that apricot smells like, what that apple smells like, what those strawberries smell like, right? Hopefully you're doing this in the privacy of your own home and you don't feel like a weirdo just smelling fruit in your kitchen, but that's a way to train your olfactories and again, give yourself that fresh memory. So a couple weeks from now, a couple months from now, when you're at a whiskey tasting or a wine tasting and you're going through and you're in a room with a bunch of people and they're all sharing their tasting notes, you have those fresh memories to access. And then you totally get those tasting notes because they're fresh in your memory bank for sure. So smelling this, and let's go ahead and taste it together. So give it a little sip. Always chew on your whiskey. Now going back and forth, what do you guys smell and what do you guys taste on this 4-grain bourbon? There's a lot more going on.
Yeah. Definitely more like the tea leaf and like tobacco leafy notes on the palate more than on the nose. Yeah, definitely more savory than it tastes a little bit, smelled a little bit more richer than it actually like on the palate is.
Yeah, and it's lingering on our palate a little bit, right? Like I'm still kind of like going like that, right? Smacking my lips together. Like it's still present on the palate, absolutely. And remember, we've got all 4 grains playing together here. So I'm definitely getting that orange note. I'm definitely getting that citrus note, that black tea note, that cherry note, right? There's a lot going on in this glass.
And I get like even that like that dried apricot, like those candy apricots.
Mm-hmm. Cool, let's give this one more taste neat, and then we're gonna try it adding our water to it. Now remember, you only have 2 more opportunities. So it's hard for me to show you guys on screen, but I'll show you how I'm gonna do it. I'm at eye level with my glass. I'm gonna introduce my little droplet of water and I see that separation. It happens super fast, like I said, within 30 seconds. But you see your whiskey kind of separating in your glass. This is that fun with organic chemistry that we didn't get in high school, right? But again, we're creating that exothermic heat reaction. We're bringing all of the grain oils to the surface, right? So if you see little white squiggly lines or little whiskey ghosts, as we like to call them, those are your grain oils being forced to the surface on your glass. So give this a nose with your water added. What do you guys smell?
More of the apricot, definitely more of
Yeah.
that fruit, more of the citrus too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sweet, sweet, sweet for me on this. A lot more citrus, a lot more of that like orange brine.
I get that green apple that's there
yes.
for sure. Almost like a caramel covered green apple, like you get around Halloween time, right? That's what I'm getting for sure.
I like that.
And it's soft, right? It definitely, we're not getting that alcohol burn on our nose. Hopefully we're not getting it on our palate as well, because we should be pretty acclimated by this point, right? So this is opening up and it's sweet like candy, right? I'm gonna go ahead and give it a taste. And solid tasting note I always get on the bourbon when we add water, butterscotch. But like Werther's original, like those gold that grandma had on the coffee table, right? Like that is the butterscotch note that I get off of this for sure. What do you guys taste?
Yeah, definitely the butterscotch. It gets a little bit more of that mouth coating kind of idea too. So you get, that kind of like, fills in a lot more. But then I think it's a little bit more floral on the finish, at least for me. Like you get a little bit more of those leafy kind of like Earl Grey notes or some black tea notes, excuse me. A little bit more of that kind of cinnamon baking spice on the finish too.
Totally. Absolutely.
More
Spicy on the finish, yeah.
Yes. And you guys that are tuning into that spicy note, that's that rye. We haven't gotten there yet, but that rye is present in the 4-grain bourbon at 10%. So just think about that. You're picking up on a 10% tasting note for sure. Like those peppery notes, that spicy note, that's coming from the rye itself. And that's the next one that we're going to move into. But you absolutely are picking that up on the bourbon. So kudos to you for picking up on that before we even tasted it.
Pour yourself a little more because you've got a
You
great.
Reward yourself. Get a little bit more of that spice in your life.
Yeah. Absolutely. So what do we think? Do we like the bourbon or do we still think that we stand with the wheat or the barley as far as the 3 that we've tasted? Raise your hand if you like barley. That was the first one. Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? We got one.
Marilyn likes the barley. All right.
All right. Raise your hand if you like the wheat. All right.
Rody's a wheat fan.
All right. Raise your hand if you like the bourbon. Okay. Yeah.
Well, now we're moving on to my personal favorite, rye. But I still have a little bit in my glass, Crystal, of the bourbon. And sometimes, I do have to drive home and I want to get onto the rye. So what we do here, because we are in the barrel warehouse, we talked about the devil's cut, which is what we lose to the barrel. The other side of that is the angel's share, what we lose to evaporation as those barrels age. But sometimes we like to feed our angels on the outside. So hopefully they take a little bit less from the inside. So I have a little bit left in my glass. So I'm just going to go ahead and feed the angels there. Yeah. And then hopefully they'll appreciate that and they won't take so much from the inside of our barrel from that evaporation.
That's awesome.
On to my favorite, that green label. Hopefully you're kind of keeping track because it is the last one you haven't drank yet. So hopefully we know that much.
The one that has the most amount of whiskey in it still,
Hopefully. But this is our San Luis Valley rye. Personally, my favorite, I think that America is on a rye kick right now. You will see more and more of those rye commercials out there. But our rye is super, super unique. And actually a lot of people that don't like rye end up liking our rye. And I do say rye is very much like cilantro, I found. You either love it or you hate it. There's not really an in-between for rye. But our rye is very unique for 2 big reasons. One, I already talked about where it comes from, that San Luis Valley. It does not grow anywhere else in the world. Also, our rye is 100% rye, which is fairly unique to us. Much like a bourbon, to be a bourbon, it has to be 51% corn. To be an American rye whiskey, it has to be at least 51% rye. And a lot of those rye whiskeys that you see on the market will sit right at that 51, 60%. They'll put a little corn in it to sweeten it up, and then a little bit of that malted barley for that conversion factor, because you always need a malted grain to make a whiskey. That malted grain produces that enzyme that helps convert the starches to fermentable sugars. And that malted barley, you need the least amount of it for that conversion. But guess what? You can actually malt any grain.
Except corn.
Except corn. It
'Cause
pretty
then it
much
turns
turns
into
into
popcorn.
popcorn. But wheat, rye, and barley, you can absolutely malt. But you see that 10% barley in most whiskeys because that's like that conversion grain. But our rye is 100% rye. It's 50% raw rye, 50% malted rye. So that 50-50 conversion helps with that. And so we get this very unique rye, this unique terroir, heirloom, terroir-driven rye, and 100% of that rye. So just a super unique rye expression in and of itself. But let's go ahead and give it a smell. We're moving backwards again, right? We did a single grain, the bourbon, 4 grains playing off of each other, and then now to this very spicy, very complex grain by itself again. What do we smell, guys?
So yeah, one of the biggest notes I got from this, and when I originally was trying Laws, what really drew me to this rye was like there's a spearmint, kind of like minty aspect to it that's just really unique that I'd never smelt or tried in a rye before I had this one.
Oh, Jeremy, you are speaking my language, because that is exactly what I get. Like the rye for me is so minty, so refreshing. And that actually plays to another nerve in your body. So great segue. Appreciate you for that as well. Because we talk a lot about when we're drinking whiskey, right? Smelling and tasting, smell, taste, that's a big part of it. But there's another nerve in your body that is affected by whiskey drinking, and it's called your trigeminal nerve. And it's right here in your face. And if you've ever gone to the dentist and they numb you up too bad and you're like droopy for the rest of the day, they've hit your trigeminal nerve. And there's actually 3 points of your trigeminal nerve in your face, hence tri. But when you're drinking whiskey, your trigeminal nerve tells you just one thing. It tells you a feeling, and it actually tells you either heating or cooling. So that's why when you drink a whiskey and you get that heat, but you can't pinpoint that descriptive flavor, it's because it's not a flavor. It's truly your trigeminal nerve just telling you heat. So the wheat whiskey is a great example for me for heat. Wheat gives me a lot of heat. It hits me up here. As soon as I drink the wheat whiskey, it flushes my cheeks, right? It's like heat, heat, heat. But when I drink the rye, it gives me the opposite. It hits me right here. And my trigeminal nerve tells me cooling, which then leads me to believe like more of that minty, that spearmint, almost like that eucalyptus. And then we also have like a lot of kind of spice to it, but not that traditional rye spice that you would expect. It's more of that like pepper, like serrano pepper spice. And going back to the terroir, our rye actually grows butt up against another farm that grows serrano peppers. And our farmers can speak very eloquently to the fact about how they think that close proximity to the serrano pepper farm affects the flavor of their rye as well.
Nice.
And chewing gum is a solid tasting note. Do you guys know that cinnamon gum? I am blanking on the name of it, but it's that cinnamon flavor
Big
gum.
Red?
I think it's Big Red,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
yes,
And it
Big
has
Red.
like all of 30 seconds of that cinnamon flavor, and then it's gone. But those 30 seconds of flavor, absolutely, that is a tasting note that we get off of the rye. It's like that, or no, Cinnaburst. That's the one I'm thinking of.
Oh, okay.
But same difference. It's all the same, right? But you get that chewing gum that gives you that burst of flavor and then kind of like dies out on you. That's kind of what we're experiencing when we try this whiskey for the first time. It's that burst of flavor. So 100%, that is totally a valid tasting note. Absolutely.
And Crystal and I like to do blind tastings and pour stuff and blind taste each other all the time. And we actually have, it's not even a Laws whiskey, but there's one bourbon that she poured me one time, and instantly I got bubble yum. Like that tape, remember? It's like that sugary sweet. And honestly, it was just like, that was my limbic system, like pulled me back in, and I was just like bubble yum.
Yep.
And that's all I taste in this whiskey. And Crystal, other people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't get that. But I know that's okay. That's how I evaluate whiskey. But I mean, bubblegum to the extreme. It just pulls me right back.
That's a memory that you're tasting, as she was mentioning. So that's a solid tasting note for sure.
I had
I just said, have we taken a sip?
I don't know. I mean, I
Let's
think
do
I
it.
have, but I haven't instructed you.
experiment.
Sip
Yes.
and enjoy.
And that's the first thing that I tasted, smelled this of it. That's the same as the spirit.
What was that from Maryland? We missed that little tasting note.
Oh, the Wrigley gum.
Oh, the Wrigley.
Yes.
I was just saying the other day I haven't had it in years, this that pack of Wrigley spearmint gum. And then first thing I tasted it, I went, boing, spearmint.
Yeah,
Right?
totally. Yeah.
Taking you to that memory. Absolutely.
And that's what we always need to train our nose. Crystal talked about, don't skip leg day, don't skip nose day. I love that dad joke. I mean, I don't cook, my husband cooks, but I'm constantly driving him absolutely crazy because he's cooking. And I'm just like in the kitchen smelling all the spices. He's like, I'm like, no, I'm working. I'm doing research right now.
R&D.
But always like, oh, like how long has this banana been out? Like, let's smell this banana on the counter after it's ripening for a day. How about 3 days? That's how you collect those tasting notes, by collecting more memories for yourself. Absolutely. And you can go online, you can buy those fancy expensive nosing kits, or you can just take a walk through your kitchen and drive your husband crazy while he tries to cook.
And also those nosing kits, I've seen a couple of those. I've seen like my Somm friends who like got them together and did them. Those don't always smell like they say they're gonna smell. Like, try the real thing.
You can make your own tasting kit, nosing kit, right in your own kitchen, right in your own garden. Those are the best places to start for sure. And then just remember that when you're at a tasting, you know, like sometimes closing your eyes, right? Sometimes removing one of those senses will kind of heighten some of those other senses. So hopefully you don't feel too weird doing that, especially in the privacy of your own home, but give it a nose with your eyes closed versus with your eyes open. See what happens when you take away one of those senses, right? Like you may get more on that tasting experience than you did with your eyes open. There's lots of different ways to approach it. We're just trying to give you all the toolkit so that you can feel confident going forward and tasting spirits and enjoying spirits the same way that you've been trained with wine, right? Because it is very, very applicable in that sense.
And then if you guys haven't already, feel free to add some water to this rye.
Check out your glass when
yes.
you do it. This is the oiliest grain out of all of them, so you're really gonna see that reaction happen.
This is a fun one. Rye is a spicy, kind of feisty little grain. So check it out when you add the water. It does have that viscousy that's even as the most oily grain, so you get more of that viscousy, oily mouth feel to it too. It's a little bit heavier in the mouth, but it's just really funky as you add water to it. And then when you add water to it, you want to wait a minute, wait 2 minutes, wait 5 minutes if you can with this rye, because it is very spicy. And when you add water to rye, really to any whiskey, but very much with rye, when you add water to that rye, it's just like if I was to go to your house and wake you up by pouring a big glass of water over you. Right? Glass bucket of ice water over your head. You're essentially going to piss that whiskey off, right? At first, when you introduce water to whiskey, the whiskey's kind of like, oop, I don't like this. What are you doing to me? And then it mellows out. You shock it first and then it chills out. So if you were to add water and then take a sip right away, it actually might taste more spicy. You're tasting a pissed off whiskey right away until you actually let it mellow out.
Which I think Jeremy did. Was that pissed off for you, Jeremy?
Was that a
right,
little
right
spicy?
when you
Did
went
you-
for it?
So no, actually, I added the water a little earlier, so it had a little bit of time to mellow out. So yeah.
You're a professional. You know what you're doing.
But it's the same thing when we're proofing down our whiskey, when we're proofing down our rye, right? We're taking these 30 to 50 barrels and marrying them together in this big tank. And then we're going to add water to it, but we're not dumping a bunch of water to proof it down to that 95 proof all at once, right? We proof it only about a proof a day, and we slowly add water almost over about 2 weeks to get it to that 95 proof. So we don't shock that whiskey. We take a lot of care, more care that Crystal and I have found, surprisingly, than a lot of other distilleries. It is, grain to barrel to glass, but we take that time in between in every part of to let that whiskey rest, to let it calm down. So we're never giving you shocked whiskey. It's never coming out right onto the market. We're proofing it down slowly. Once that whiskey goes into glass, it sits at least 2 weeks before we actually drive it out anywhere, before it's actually going to get into your hands. So you're never going to get this fiery, shocked whiskey from us that we're just pushing out of the warehouse for you.
So let's try the rye with that water added. What do y'all think?
Smooth.
Definitely still minty, but more dark chocolate. Like there's a little
Yes.
bit more richness to it on the back end to me. Like a drier chocolate though, so it becomes more floral rye spice on the finish again. Like you get a little bit more cinnamon on there, but then it gets a little softer spearminty rye on the finish after that.
Absolutely, 100%. And just like wine, paired, right? So this is a great segue. I would absolutely pair like a 70% cacao or higher chocolate bar with this rye whiskey. And you can drink this on its own and then introduce a little bite of that chocolate. And just like that's going to change the profile of that beautiful Barolo that you're drinking from Italy, it will change the profile of that rye whiskey just by introducing that little nib of chocolate, right? These things, whiskey can be paired with cheese, can be paired with chocolates, can be paired with full-on meals, just like your wine can, absolutely. And those elements of food are going to bring out different flavor notes in the whiskey that aren't present when you just are trying it on its own. So absolutely, one of my favorite pairings is to do a 70% cacao chocolate bar with our rye whiskey and let people taste it neat on its own and then give them that little nib of chocolate to try with it. That's another great way to explore your whiskey. And once again, you're not taking anything away from it. You're simply amplifying and muting certain characteristics by introducing that element of food to pair with your whiskey.
So if you're out to a nice dinner and you order dessert and you want a little dessert and nightcap, I would always go with like that chocolate cake and that rye neat pour
Absolutely.
on a fancy date. That's what
you
I'm
don't
going
always
for.
have to do port or sherry. Yourself a delicious whiskey to pair with your dessert. Absolutely. Awesome. So giving this a nose, giving it a taste, what do you all think of the rye whiskey?
Loving it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Love it.
that's the favorite.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah.
Nice.
Favorite for some. Okay.
You're in good company. We all love the rye around here
You're
too.
speaking my language for sure.
But is it different than other ryes that you may have tried?
Yes. Yes.
No,
Yeah, right?
it's much smoother.
Yeah.
Neat.
It does have that spice to it, right? But I feel like that spice is something that people expect in rye, and that's that thing that they like or they don't. And this has kind of that different spice note, right? It's that spice, it's that kind of tang to it, but it's toned down where it's like almost that mint or spearmint to it as well. So it is kind of that unique rye.
And that maple syrup is present for me. It absolutely is. Like that maple, like a clutch tasting note, but like legit good maple syrup, like grade A, right? Like, come on.
Like the husband in
Yeah.
Vermont.
Like we're
maple
spending
syrup.
some money on our maple syrup on this one. This ain't your Aunt Jemima's, that's for sure.
Oh, please. Oh, you weren't supposed to hear that.
My grandfather was actually a maple syrup farmer. He owned a maple farm in
Oh,
Vermont.
wow.
Yeah.
I did not know
So
that
that's a
about you.
memory. That's a memory for me. So
In Vermont.
Generational memories, nice.
Alrighty, y'all. So we have tried 4 different whiskeys with you. Let's just recap. We started with our 100% barley whiskey. Then we moved into our 100% wheat whiskey. And then, of course, with great bourbon comes great responsibility. So we chatted about all that with our 4-grain straight bourbon whiskey. And then we finished with our 100% rye whiskey. So can we get a tally? Out of everything that we've tried today, what was your favorite? Raise your hand if you like that malt. Nobody. Okay, raise your hand if you. Oh wait, we got one. We got
Yeah,
one.
I was like, Lynn likes it. Lynn likes it.
Favorite. Raise your hand if you like that wheat. There we go. We got one. Raise your hand if you like that 4-grain bourbon.
Oh, the right. Okay.
Oh, there we go. Okay, and then raise your hand if you like that rye whiskey.
all
Can I
right.
also raise my hand? I raised my hand.
Chicken dinner. We saved
I
the
know I
best.
raised my hand. I raised my hand twice, but it's like,
But Crystal already mentioned it too. Even the fanciest whiskey tasters will tell you that the first one that they taste is very rarely their favorite
Mhm.
that first time. So I definitely encourage you, if you have some left, go ahead and do it tomorrow. Do it the next day and just change up the order and see if you actually get a different favorite, because a lot of times you might, as you're just acclimating differently and trying them in a different order.
Absolutely. And we are
Definitely.
almost at our time, y'all, but we are here available for any final questions, comments, concerns, any life advice you want from us. Obviously, we have great hair rituals, so
And we are now, so we have lots of life advice to throw at you.
do you guys have any final questions to kind of round out this virtual tasting with y'all?
Well, if people want to think about questions, I just want a quick comment. Want to again thank you all for coming out on Thursday for this. Really excited. Thank you, Crystal and Casey, for being in Denver and doing this with us. Just one of the really cool things about Laws, the reason why I enjoyed them a lot, and the reason why I wanted to do this was to show you how much care that they put into this stuff. I mean, you can see from what Crystal and Casey have been talking about, like how much effort and again, no shortcuts or anything that they take, making these grains that are almost gone and buried, now making them popular whiskeys, or now making them whiskeys that people are going to know about, is awesome. But also a thing that I mentioned in the email that I sent to y'all, but maybe I didn't mention at the beginning of this, is when Laws opened, they opened after barreling everything. So they put things in barrels for the 3 years, it sounds like, and then just waited. Most whiskey companies, no shade to them, but most whiskey companies will go to Indiana, they'll go to Kentucky, find a distillery that will make something similar to what they're going to be barreling or what they'll be bottling later, and put that out until the time of their stuff maturity. Laws, is that dedicated and trusted their brand that much that they were like, we're just going to sit for 3 years and let this stuff mature because we know it's going to be awesome. And that's just that's always a tip of the cap for me, because that just shows A, that they care, and B, that they know what they're doing. So just wanted to make that note there again.
Yeah, every bottle of Laws whiskey you all have ever tried and tasted was literally distilled, aged, and bottled by us. So we are standing in Laws Whiskey House. We did not release vodka. We did not release gin, right? We simply made whiskey. We stuck it in a barrel. We somewhat patiently waited until it was ready for you all. And like I said, with that straight requirement, right? Alan Laws, our CEO and founder, he pulled that barrel down after 2 years. He tasted it and decided, no, this is not ready. This is not ready to release to the public. So we let that barrel age for a whole other year before we released our product to the public. So we laid our first barrel down July 4th, 2011. We did not sell our first bottle until October 2014. And we didn't do anything in between that. So this past July 4th, we celebrated our 10-year distilling anniversary. And we had folks on our tour that were like, this is crazy. I swear I've known about you guys from the beginning, but how have you been around for 10 years? And I've only known about you for 7 years. And that's public only found out about us once we finally released our product to the public. So there's a lot of cheeky elements to our distillery, and one of them is our quote unquote unofficial mascot. So it is a gargoyle, and whatever our laws does is with intention. So a gargoyle protects against evil spirits. And what were we making inside the distillery? Good spirits. So on our for those first 3 years, when we were not selling any product, we simply had Gargoyle Enterprises on that storefront. So if you drove past our little street where our distillery is located, you'd be like, oh, I don't know, what are they doing? Making gargoyles in there? You would not think twice that that was a whiskey distillery. But once you know the story of our mascot and you understand why Gargoyle Enterprises was out on that storefront, you understand we were protecting our good spirits from any evil spirits until we were ready to release those good spirits to the general public. So that's part of our history. That's part of who we are. Like I said, we've never released anything else, and there's nothing wrong with releasing a vodka or a gin early on. Like Jeremy said, sometimes you just got to get your name out into the market and get consumers aware of who you are, and then just hope they'll hang tight until you have a product to release to them. We are in the middle of a multi-year expansion plan where we're actually growing our distillery, growing our production, and we're just sitting back here like fingers crossed, you as the consumers still want this delicious product 3, 4, 5 years from now when we actually have ramped up that production and have even more to offer up to you all. Because again, time is that critical ingredient in this process, and we cannot cut that. We have to honor that time that that spirit hangs out in that barrel. So absolutely, that is part of who we are as a whiskey distillery, and we are very proud of that fact. Every bottle of Law's whiskey you've ever seen or tasted has been literally distilled, aged, and bottled by us. So we are very proud of that.
Yeah. And I mean, that is hard, right, Jeremy? You mentioned it. You just have to sit and wait. And Al maybe was not so patient. And when he decided to go ahead and wait that 3rd year, he went out and got a tattoo of a gargoyle sitting on a barrel. Make no shortcuts. We need to be patient. And so we appreciate Al for doing that. And Al's great for many, many reasons, but he has a really great way of sharing his passion and then also being a whiskey nerd and then kind of seeing that whiskey nerdiness in other people and collecting other whiskey nerds.
And it just trickles down to us. Everything that you guys are seeing, how passionate we are about this product, this literally comes from Al. He radiates this passion onto us, and then we go out and be brand ambassadors for the company, but it all comes from Al.
Yeah.
So he is very, very passionate about whiskey. You'll never see a glass of wine in his hand. You'll rarely see a glass of beer in his hand. You will always see a glass of whiskey in this man's hand. So he is very, very passionate about not only drinking whiskey, but making whiskey and making quality whiskey for you all to enjoy.
Yep. So we are Law's Whiskey House, but now we like to joke, it's not a whiskey house, it's a whiskey home. So thank you for coming in essentially Crystal and I's living room and drinking some whiskey with us this evening.
Yes. Thank you all so much. This has been such a treat to share a delicious whiskey, a great story with you all. And just remember, whiskey is meant to be shared, right? Pull out those nice bottles when you got somebody over that wants to hang out. Pour them a glass of that delicious whiskey. You just never know when it may be your last glass of whiskey with someone. So don't stick onto those glasses. That is a true testament that Al has taught all of us. We were always the ones that were like, we buy a bottle, we save a bottle. It's like, what do you say? You can't take it with you. So pop those nice bottles open, share them with someone, because guess what? There's always good whiskey aging somewhere. So have no fear. Whatever you have in your bottle, open it up and enjoy it, because there's always going to be more good whiskey coming down the pipeline. So cheers, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Yay. And Casey's going to go ahead and drop my email in the chat. If you all have any further questions, if you have any life advice that you want from either one of us, hey, if you guys are planning a trip out here to Denver, Colorado, please let us know. We would be more than happy to roll out the red carpet, invite you into the distillery, and have you come hang out with all of us. Or like I said, just feel free to send us any follow-up questions that you may have. And Jeremy is for sure your best resource for getting Laws whiskey. So definitely check in with him at the store.
We appreciate you, Jeremy.
Yeah. So thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank
great
you, Jeremy.
time. I hope you all
Yeah.
enjoyed this. Crystal,
Thanks,
Casey,
thanks,
thank you very much
Jeremy.
for everything.
Trip.
Right on. Well, everybody have a great night. I'll see you at the store soon. Crystal, Casey,
Yeah.
next time when I go out to Denver to visit my friend Katie, we'll make sure to see y'all.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Rody.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, have a good one.